In our next problem from Chapter 13, Financial Performance Measurement, we're going to look at problem SE5 on page 618, where we're looking at trend analysis. And as I indicated in our notes, trend analysis is a variation of sorts of our horizontal analysis. What we're going to look at, what we looked at in our horizontal analysis was basically year-over-year change. Now we're going to take and layer onto that successive years worth of changes to see if there's any trend that we can detect in the change that's taking place for a company. And they provide us with a good example on page 597 in our textbook. So I'll just kind of quickly throw that up here for you to look at. And you can kind of see how they have the dollar values here represented, and then they show the trend analysis over the subsequent years, starting with your base year. So your base year is always going to be at 100%, and then you're going to look at the changes from that 100% for each of the years. So you're always going back and comparing it to the base year and looking at how much the change is from that base year. A little variation on the trend analysis is to trend things instead of from a base year, to trend them from consecutive years, but we'll talk about that in class when we're together. Okay, and that formula that we discussed for our trend analysis back in our notes was just to look at the index year amount, so the year that we're looking at, and compare it to our base year and see how much the variable has changed from the first year to the index year, and then multiply that by 100. So let's look at what that's going to look at for our problem on page 618. So on page 618, our problem data is to use the information for net sales and accounts receivable from 2011 and demonstrate a trend from 2011 to 2012 and then on to 2013, and determine whether the results suggest a favorable or unfavorable trend, what's taking place. And we're going to look at it first from our net sales perspective. Okay, so in trying to figure out what is our formula that we're going to use our trend analysis formula, and that basically says our index year divided by our base year. We're going to multiply that by 100. So let's look at 2011, which is our base year. Looking at 2011, our data for net sales, let's look at net sales first. Okay. Our net sales is 224,000. So we're going to put our index year and our base year as the same for this particular year because it's our base year. So 224 over 224 times 100 is going to be 100%. Hopefully everybody can do that one. So really for these we can basically assume that the other one is going to be 100 as well. So then let's look at our 2012 year. Our 2012 year, we had 272,000 in net sales. So that's going to be our index amount, 272 over 224, and multiply by 100. That's going to give us 121.4%. So we'll put that up here. And then our last year, 2013, our net sales figure was 316,000. We'll put that again over our base year of 224, multiply by 100, and we get 141.1%. Okay, so we can see, before we go too far, we can see that clearly our sales figures are trending up from our base year over the 2 subsequent years. Now, let's look at our accounts receivable for the same period of time. And in our 2011 year, we saw that our data was 42,000 over 42,000 multiplied by 100, and we get 100, and we noted that up above. If we go to 2012, our data for 2012 showed that we had accounts receivable of 64,000, that's looking a little blurry, 64,000, and a base year was 42, so we'll put 64,000 over 42,000 and multiply that, and we get 152.4%. $152.4. And then our last year is 2013. And 2013 was 86,000. And again, we put it over our base year, 42,000. And we get 204.8%. And we think to ourselves, wow, look at this. Sales are going up, accounts receivable are going up. Woohoo, this is great, right? We're trying to look at, is this a favorable or an unfavorable trend? So what are your thoughts? Think about that. Well, I look at it and I would say, this seems like a fairly favorable trend for our sales. Now again, this is in isolation. We don't know what's going on in the marketplace. We don't know what's going on with our competitors. We can't 100% tell, but it seems relatively favorable. Okay? But then we have to look at this accounts receivable trend. And as a manager in a business, I might have some concerns here. This is telling me that my sales are going up at a much slower pace than my accounts receivable. This is a very significant difference here, and it would be a very big concern to me. This may mean that I'm having trouble collecting some of my receivables. It may even mean that I might have to write off some of my receivables, that maybe some of my receivables are not collectible because they're out there for so long. So my receivables could be resulting in a significant cash flow problem for me, because if you remember when we've been talking about cash flow, when we sell things, if we're not selling it for cash, that's a use of our cash if we're selling it on account, because we haven't collected that cash yet. So the higher this number goes relative to our sales, the slower that indicates that our receivables are being collected, and it becomes a concern that we're not going to be receiving those accounts or collecting on those accounts quickly enough to generate cash flow for us. So that's a definitely unfavorable trend and something that we would be concerned with. Okay, and there we go with SE5. And now we're going to move over to SE7 and talk about our common size balance sheet for Otis Inc. On page 619. And our common size analysis, we have done this before. This is our component percentage analysis. We've done it in the past really by focusing on the income statement, but now we're going to look at the balance sheet. And I'll give you a quick snapshot of our balance sheet for Otis. and we're going to do our vertical analysis on Otis. We're going to look at and try to determine what percentage of our total assets do these components represent. And then the same with our liabilities and stockholders' equity. What percentage do my current liabilities make up of my total liabilities and stockholders' equity? What percentage is made up by long-term debt, and what percentage by stockholders' equity? And then we can compare the 2 years, okay? So how do we figure out our component percentage? We just, we take that component item and we divide it by the total item. So in this particular case, if we're going to look at the total assets, we're going to look at the current assets to total assets and the property, plant, and equipment to total assets. So if we look at 2012, our current assets to our total assets, we see that in the problem, our current assets were $48,000 and our total assets were $308,000. And when we do the math, we divide 48 by 308 and we get 15.6%. So 15.6%. And then we do the same thing with our property, plant, and equipment divided by our total assets. And we see our property, plant, and equipment, 260 over 308. And for this, we get 84.4%. And then this total is going to be 100%. Our total to ourselves is 100%, obviously. And if it's not, we've got a problem. Okay, and then we look at, for 2011, we have 40,000 over 240,000. So we're going to look at the current assets over the total assets for that particular year. And that gives us a percentage of 16.7%. And then we have our property, plant, and equipment at 200 over 240, and that represents 83.3%. And then we can put this up here, 16.7% and 83.3%. And these should obviously all equal down to 100%. Okay, and then we can do the same thing with our liabilities and stockholders' equity. This is 2000. Okay, so this is our assets. This is our liabilities and stockholders' equity. So if we do our current liabilities, we see current liabilities are 36,000 over the 308. And let's just put the formulas all up here. Our long-term liabilities are 180 over 308, and then our stockholders' equity are 92 over 308. So 36 over 308, and we get 11.7%. 180 is over 308, 58.4%. And stockholders' equity is 29.9%. And again, we can put this information up here at 11.7%. 58.4% and 29.9%, or 100%. And then looking at 2011 data, we see that we have 44 over 240, we have 120 over 240, and we have 76 over 240. And 44 represents 18.3%. 50% is attributable to long-term debt, long-term liabilities. And then our stockholders' equity is 31.7%. And again, we can put this data up here, 18.3%, 50.0%, and 31.7%, which should all equal to 100%. So now, what is this telling us about Otis's balance sheet? Well, one thing that we can notice about their assets is we can see that their assets are very heavily weighted towards their property, plant, and equipment, their long-term assets. So if we've said in the past that we want to finance our long-term assets with long-term debt, we would expect, certainly, that a heavier percentage of our liabilities would be in long-term debt because our heavy percentage of assets are in long-term assets. So we can see that that is truly the case here. So that's good, that it's that they're relatively longer-term assets financing longer-term, longer-term liabilities financing longer-term assets. So that's appropriate. And so we would also expect then that their current liabilities, since their current liabilities are a lower percentage of their total assets, their current assets are a lower percentage of their total assets, that their long-term liabilities would be a less significant percentage of their total liabilities and stockholders' equity. So both of those things are good. And we can see that some of their property, plant, and equipment are also financed by their stockholders' equity, and that the same goes true for their current liabilities. So they're balancing their balance sheet fairly well. We can see a little bit of a shift in, their asset composition between the years. We can see a little bit of a decrease in their current assets and maybe a little bit more investment in long-term assets in the year. And those would be questions that we would ask a little bit about of our company, try to find out why, what's causing that shift. But it's not significant, so it's probably fine. So in any case, that's a little bit about our vertical analysis for the balance sheet.